Thanks very much, Leon, for the invite. We've had the Minister of Finance's budget speech or mini budget speech this afternoon. I've got a couple of things I would like to share with you on that. But before I start with my presentation of what can be expected for the next 10 years, I think it's important, first of all, just to put my values on the table. Because if you listen to economists, you get economists with all different views. And you know, they always make these jokes about economists saying that economists never agree about this and that. And the reason for that is simply because economists believe in different things. They come from different schools of thought. They look at things through different glasses. So let me just put my values on the table and to tell you what I am, and I will also tell you why I am this, why I believe in what I believe in. I believe in personal freedom. I believe in personal property rights, private property rights, and I really believe, and with that I believe the really very, very broad definition there. I believe this stuff is mine. But I also believe my life belongs to myself, and if somebody steals this stuff, we call it theft, and if you take my life away, we call it murder. It also means that I've got the right to my labor. I can sell it to whoever I want to, at whatever price I want to. In fact, I am the most important person in this country. And I can do whatever I want to. And there's only one thing that limits all these rights that I have, and that's your rights. So we are the most important people in this country. So those are my values. And the reason why I have these values is because where we come from. And this graph tells us very nicely where we come from. Now, I'm not going to go back 4 million years ago because our history really goes back 4 million years ago. I'm only going to go back about 100,000 years ago. 100,000 years ago, and in a place called Blombos in the Southern Cape, close to this town called Stilbaai, the oldest form of abstract thinking, or the oldest form of art, was actually discovered 100,000 years ago. And that was the beginning of what we call today humans. And the past 100,000 years, a couple of things happened. And I just want to touch on a couple of things. Remember, all decisions that you will always make are always economic decisions. Because you always have a choice between this or that. So economics is not about graphs and exchange rates and stuff like that. Economics really is about people. If you understand people, then you understand why the markets do what they do. The markets is not some guy somewhere, it's us. We are the markets, for example. Alright, so what's happened the past, say, 100,000 years? Not much really. Not really much. Until about 15,000 years ago. Up to about 15,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers. We were walking around in groups of about 15. The environment couldn't take more than about 15 people. You kill something, you eat it straight away. You dig something up, you eat it straight away. There wasn't something called private property rights because there wasn't private property really. But 15,000 years ago, something started to change. And we domesticated the first animals about 15,000 years ago. And the rules of the game gradually started to change. Because now all of a sudden, I have something that is mine. It's my cow. It is my tamed wolf, for instance. And again, nothing much happened for about 5,000 years thereafter. We gathered a couple of cattle. We started producing some surpluses. We could actually support bigger groups, about 50, 100, or even 300. So, and it was much easier to live in a group and in this environment where we actually domesticated animals. Then a massive economic breakthrough happened about 10,000 years ago when we first domesticated plants, especially grain. And if you domesticate grain, you produce a massive surplus. But very importantly, it's not your property rights over the grain that you've planted that becomes important. Now there's a new dimension to private property rights, and that's my rights over land. I also produce a much bigger surplus now. I could actually afford to rent or hire somebody to look after my harvest, like an army, for example. I have to stay put for some time, because unlike animals, plants do not move around. So I have to stay there, and I can build big buildings, and I can get politicians to take my money, and I can get ruling classes, and I can get job specialization and all that. And gradually that evolved over time, and today where we are, it's the next step in this whole process of one thing only, and that is to protect private property rights. And today we've got a number of institutions, like for example a government, like a constitution, like a constitutional court, like a cabinet, or a president even, or a free independent press, or a free and independent judiciary. And those things are there for one reason only, and that's to protect my private property.
And politicians try to undermine this all the time because they are rent seekers. They want to take things away from us that doesn't belong to them, that they haven't worked for. But the evolution and this golden thread through our evolution has got one thing, one golden thread, and that is private property rights. But about 2,000 years ago, a guy with the name of Plato, he started changing track. He said, no. It's not private property really matters. What matters really is communal property. It belongs to everybody. And about 150 years ago, a guy formalized this thinking, and his name was Karl Marx. Karl Marx said, no, it's not the individual that matters, it is the community. And in fact, the old word for a local council is, the old Russian word for a local council is a Soviet. And that's where the name, the Union of the Socialist Soviet Republics, come from. And what Karl Marx actually said is that when we've got this evolution of humankind, of freedom and of private property rights, let's take a detour and let's say we're going to create a new system and things belong to the community and not to the individual anymore. It's really interesting to, and I'm not saying the government hasn't got a job to do, government's got certain functions to do. Their job certainly is to provide collective goods. Defense is an excellent example of collective goods. So what do we have? And quite interesting, if you really go to the theory, you will find in a free market system that the individual is the most important person because the private property rights is in the hands of the individuals. And in a real communist, a theoretical communist system, the private property or property is in the hands of the Soviet. That's the idea. In a real communist system, a theoretical communist system, you do not have money. You do not even have politicians. And the difference between the two is really not really that much. It's pretty much the same. But in 1917, a new guy came to power and his name was Lenin, and he realized there's a bit of a problem. Now I'm married to a Russian woman, and
It's a bit of a problem.
that is a bit of a problem. She's the Secretary General of our household. And she told me that they were taught at school that you will eventually go, once we've reached this wonderful place of communism, you'll go to a shop, and you will go in, you will take whatever you need, you don't need money. That's what they really believed. You know. Unfortunately, the problem is that in a free market system, what you do, you give people the freedom to do whatever they want to. And in a magic way, we call it the magic, the invisible hand. In a magic way, the invisible hand get people to produce stuff. In a system that belongs to everybody, where there's collective ownership, people, after a while, you can get people to do stuff if they believe in the case, if they believe in Mother Russia, for example. But after a while, they're going to start asking questions. You find it quite often in the religions. People believe in a case of a specific religion, they start doing very stupid things. But after a while, they say, listen, but I don't believe in this case anymore. And Lenin wrote an essay, and this essay is called, What Should Be Done. And it's very interesting. The founding party of the Economic Freedom Fighters was also called What Should Be Done. So what did Lenin say? Lenin said, in order to achieve this wonderful world of communism, what we need to do, we first have to centralize all the power, implement all the things, all the structures necessary for a communist system, and then we give the power back. That's the idea. That's Lenin. The problem is they never gave the power back. And the problem is, after a while, people start complaining and say, listen, I don't want to work anymore because I want a bigger car, and that guy isn't working hard, and so on. And now you have to start implementing laws to force people to work, to force people to keep on producing. Well, in a free market system, you just leave people. And inevitably what happens over time, in a free market system, you've got a system of freedom, and in a centrally controlled system, because that is what communism eventually becomes. It becomes a centrally controlled system, it becomes a system of fear. Because you can only, through fear, force people to produce stuff. And you can only, through a system of real freedom, allow people real freedom to produce whatever they want. And that's the difference between these two systems. What we have in South Africa today, we've got a government, and I will show you why, that's moving to the left. And the left can be in a direction. What I mean is that the government is getting more involved in the economy. We get more state intervention in the economy, more state participation in the economy. And it's not only the ANC government, the Democratic Alliance as well. If you analyze their different policies, they've also moved to the left. They're politicians, they're trying to do exactly the same trick what the ANC did. The ANC pushed the National Party out of the middle by simply by becoming the National Party in terms of their policies. Trevor Manuel was a real neoliberalist. He privatized. That's neoliberalism. He privatized, for instance. And what we see today, and then subsequently it moves to the left, and the DA is trying to take it over at that spot. So we've got a government moving to the left, and with that we've got the opposition parties also moving to the left. I've got examples here of different legislations and policy statements, and even comments by the Constitutional Court and so on about private property. Now there's a Constitutional Court verdict, for example. There are 14 examples here. You can go through this if you want. I'll put it on our website. What is happening today, there is a massive attack on private property rights in South Africa. A massive attack on private property rights. You get it in all sort of forms. You even got the Constitutional Court recently saying that if the state expropriates something from an individual, and the state keeps that on behalf of somebody else, that's not expropriation. The state doesn't have to pay you something for that. They simply can take it. And that's applicable not only to land, it's about everything. So without that, private property rights are under attack, and I'm not going to go through the list there on all the different things. The state in South Africa is getting bigger. I've got a summary here of what the Auditor General is saying about the state and the state-owned enterprises in South Africa today. The biggest single threat today to the South African economy is a civil service that's collapsing in its own weight and its own incompetence. I'm talking about the local authorities, the provincial authorities, the national departments, and I'm talking about the state-owned enterprises. We've done a calculation, state-owned enterprise Eskom, for example. The cost to the South African economy because of a lack of energy in South Africa is 300 billion rand per annum. The South African economy would have been 10% bigger than what it is if we had sufficient electricity. There are a lot of. The single biggest expenditure item on the budget of the Minister of Finance is education. We spend 200 billion rand annually on education. If you compare South Africa on a relative and absolute basis, it's more than most countries in the world. The outcome is bad. The outcome is sometimes the worst in the world. If you compare South Africa to Mozambique, the grade 3s, their literacy and numeracy rates are better than South Africa, and they give schooling under trees quite often. It's not a money matter. It's a management issue. Fortunately, the private sector is there, and we find it everywhere. Private sector schools becoming quite very successful, and people are, and I think Leon made this comment, is that it's one of the few industries where you actually reduce the price of a product called private schooling. You reduce the price of that, and people buy less of it. Not more, less of it, because they know the quality of this product is absolutely appalling. Okay. Maybe just a comment, if you want to buy a really good book, second best book ever written. It's Animal Farm, by Animal Farm, and it's a wonderful book about politics and about economics. A few suggestions about what you can do to protect your private property rights. Without a doubt, it's under attack. Like, for example, if you buy an income generating asset, it will be a good idea to borrow against that. To buy a property, borrow money so the bank can carry some of the risk, for example. And another important way of hedging you against this attack on your private property is to make sure some of your assets are abroad. Make sure structures like trust and companies and the like, and go and ask your financial advisor if you don't know how to do that. Rent rather than buy. For instance, don't run out there and go and do this necessarily. It depends on individual to individual. But we've got clients, for example, they've sold their farms to the state. They gave us the money to manage, and they rent the farms back for next to nothing. So they've got the cash and they have the assets. That's sort of examples that you can do. But get foreigners to become part of your partners, and don't break any law. Do pay as little tax as possible. Do not pay 1 cent too much, but make sure you pay all the tax that you need to pay, and join organizations like the Free Market Foundation to help you protect your private property rights. Okay, now I'm going to get a little bit technical, and yesterday I was thinking about something, and I think yesterday on the plane from Cape Town on the plane back, I got this sensation, and I would really like to share this with you. But before I get to that, I need to just give a bit of a background on what is currently happening in the world and where the world is at the moment. And we are seeing macroeconomic policy experiments today that we've never ever seen before. Now, some of this is a little bit technical, so just bear with me and see if you can sort of follow. And I'm not a very good teacher, but let's see if you can follow what I'm currently saying. Okay, there are a couple of things happening in the world at the moment. We know that interest rates are very low. We know there are things like, for example, quantitative easing. We know that central banks are doing all sort of stuff. They're involved in the financial markets. We know governments are spending money and all sort of things to support the economies. So let's see if we can really unpack all of this, to see what is really going on in the world. To see if we can figure out, if we know what's going on in the world, if we can figure out what's going on today, and see what's been happening the last couple of years, then just maybe we can figure out what's going to happen the next 10 years. Let's see if we can find out what is going on. I want to make two very important points now. Initially, I wanted to call my book The 10 Laws of Economics. And I was thinking, if I can get 10 laws of economics, I couldn't get to 10, but I could get to two laws. There are 2 laws in economics. Because it's one of those social sciences. It's not the natural science. You can't say 2 plus 2 is 4. Sometimes it's not 4 always in social sciences. So you have to find other laws. It's not like mathematics or science. There are 2 laws in economics. Law number 1, that's a very strong law, is people. This is about people. If you see people doing stupid things, unusual things, funny things, just look behind and see if you can find the incentive, and you will know why people are doing these things. So finding, and I've seen people doing very weird things. But once you understand why, then you understand people react to incentives. But what I want to talk to you about today is the second law in economics, and that is all returns always converge. Now, let me repeat that. All returns always converge. It means if I can get a 10% return on investing in asset A, and I can get a 5% return investing in asset B, what I will do, I will sell my asset B investment, I will take my money and put it in asset A investment. What will happen, the return on asset A will gradually fall, and the return on asset B will gradually go up, and eventually the 2 returns will be exactly the same. So there's an underlying force in the economy forcing all returns always to converge. Now this is very important. Of course, that's not in the real world how it works. You will find that you get a better return on this investment than on that investment. And the reasons why you get different returns is because in the real world it's not a theoretical world. In the real world we've got things like differences in liquidity. We've got differences in risks. That is a very high risk investment, for example. I want the higher return. In the real world you get things like laws and regulations, making it more difficult or less difficult to invest in A or B. But the underlying forces remain that returns tend to converge. We want to give you the same return. Ask anybody here. If you ask them, where do you put your money, where are your investments, the next question is going to be, what is your return? That's what people do. And that's why returns always converge. Remember that. I'm going to come back to this. All right. So, if we can find an asset somewhere that's got a very low risk, that's a very liquid asset that everybody knows about, that everybody participates in, if we can find an asset like that, then that asset is actually reflecting what all the other assets in the economy is actually doing, the underlying return in the economy. So if we can find an asset that's very liquid, very low risk, then we actually get something that reflects the economy, that is representative of what the economy tells you, what we tell you, what the return in that economy is going to be. That's a bit of a leap. If you're not confused by now, it's because you haven't been concentrating. So that's a bit of a leap. So if we know now, that cafe is giving me a 10% return, then I know the other CAF is also going to give me 10% return, except for risk maybe, and the other investment will also give me 10% return. And if I add them all together, then I know the economy will give me 10% return. That's essentially what I'm trying to get to. And what is that one asset that can give me all this information? That asset is called the bond market, the capital market. And this is what I've got here. This is the capital market. The capital market is essentially interest rates at different levels. We've got very short-term interest rates over here, and look here. Short-term interest rates at zero in most countries in the world. This is South Africa, but this is the other countries in the world. Very, very low levels of short-term interest rates. And you can see short-term interest rates are low, and as you go further out in time, interest rates gradually go up, which makes sense for all sorts of reasons. So this is an asset. If you put your money in this asset, and in 1 year's time, the return will be the gap between those two. So the bond market, the yield curve, as they call it, is actually a view on what the market thinks, how your economy is going to perform over time. Now you can see some yield curves are high, and some yield curves are low, and some yield curves are flat, and some yield curves are steep. What does it tell us? It tells us the lowest one is Japan. They've got very low short-term interest rates, and medium-term and longer-term interest rates are also very low. So the yield curve is very flat, telling us that the market tells us that economic growth in Japan is going to be very low for very long. In the case of the United States, the blue one, for instance, you can see it's still very low if you look at the numbers, for instance, but at least it's much steeper. And that's exactly what's happening in the US economy. The US economy is picking up some speed in the short term. If we look at the South African one, and this is the South African one, it's much, much higher than the rest, but it's a flat yield curve. Like that of Japan, it's much higher than the rest. Why? Because we've got much higher inflation than the rest. And this is the price we pay for inflation. But it's very flat. This is South Africa. This is South Africa's yield curve. Only South Africa. Look at South Africa's yield curve. Very flat. This is after they've taken inflation out. If you take inflation out of the numbers, what's going to happen to South Africa's economic growth is going to be less than 2% for the foreseeable future. That's what the yield curve is telling us. Okay, now you hold on to this because it's not the end of the story yet. So the market already tells us economic growth globally and locally is going to be weak. That's what we know so far. All right. What's been happening to interest rates globally? This is short-term interest rates. Short-term interest rates, this is from 1990 roughly, have been in a downward trend. So short-term interest rates, the short end of the yield curve, have been down quite sharply the last couple of years. This is the bond market. In the bond market, in most countries in the world, the yield curve has been down as well. So interest rates are going down. Not only that, if you look at the bond market globally, interest rates low. What people don't realize, not only are interest rates the lowest they've been, well, in many cases ever, you can actually calculate the interest rates in the Netherlands. The Netherlands had financial markets for the last 500-600 years. You can actually calculate the interest rates or the yield curve in the Netherlands. Interest rates today are the lowest they've been in the Netherlands the past 500 years. 500 years. Interest rates globally are exceptionally low. And people think it's good news. It's not. Because your return on this specific asset class is actually a reflection on your expectations on returns in your economy as well. Hear me out. I'm going to get to that. That's one part. Now I'm going to get to a really complicated stuff. There's a guy with the name of Milton Friedman. He won a Nobel Prize in economics, and he wanted this formula. So I'm just, again, bear with me, and I'm going to explain this formula quickly. It's very easy to understand. We've got two guys on an island. One guy stays over there in the island, other guy stays over there in the island. That guy produces 1 apple per day, and that guy produces 1 pear per day. They've got 10 rand. So every day the guy will produce his apple, he will take the 10 rand, walk all the way to the island to the other side, he will give the 10 rand to that guy, take the pear, and he walks back. Then, the afternoon, the guy will take his pear that he's produced, walk all the way to the other side of the island, give the 10 rand, and he takes an apple from this guy. So this, what happens, we produce 1 apple, 1 pear every day, and the 10 rand moves from there to there, and the afternoon it moves from there to there again. So what do we have? This is our economy. We've got money. Money is 10 rand. Money exchanges hands twice during this day. It goes from there to there, and from there to there. That's the velocity of money. We have the prices of stuff. Things cost 10 rand in our economy. An apple is 10 rand and a pear is 10 rand. And we've got the quantity of things that we produce, and every day we produce one apple, one pear. Milton Friedmans won a Nobel Prize for this. All right. It's an entity. It always works. Now let's start changing some of these variables in the economy. What do? This economy needs money. That's what central banks tell us. We want to put more money into the system. So that 10 rand that we have there, we make it 20 rand. Now the guy's got 10 rand. Tomorrow morning he's got 20 rand all of a sudden. Now he walks to the other side of the island and he gives his 20 rand to the other guy, trying to get a pair. Now one or two things will happen, or a combination. Either the guy will produce 2 pairs now, in which case we achieve exactly what we want to. We want to get more production. Or the guy's going to say, listen, I'm just going to keep on producing 1 pair, but I'm going to double the price of the pair. It's 20 rand now. In which case, we only get inflation. And that's what central banks have been doing. They've been increasing the money supply like crazy. We do not see inflation globally, and we actually do not see economic growth. Why is that? And the reason is because this guy here, velocity, has been coming down very steeply. So instead of people taking 20 rand from this side to the island to the other side of the island, they take 10 rand and leave it there, and again just use the 10 rand again. They are hoarding cash. So this massive injection of money into the financial systems is not leading to an increase in either inflation or production or economic growth. Okay, so this is what's been happening to the velocity of money. I must tell you another story. In the meantime, we have the yield curves coming down because central banks, how they put this money into the system, the mechanism is as follows. They will go to a bank and tell a bank, listen, you've got some bonds on your balance sheet. I want to put money into the system, so I'm going to print money, I'm going to give you the money, and I'm going to take your bonds from you. That's how they get the money into the system. They can't just give you 10 rand, they will buy something from you. And in the process, what they're doing, they buy long-term bonds, and they force, if there's an increase in supply or an increase in demand, you force up the price. And if you force up the price, then the return on this investment falls, so the yield falls. So long-term interest rates are coming down. So what happens? Remember, all returns always converge. Because the prices of bonds went up, now, just bear with me. Because the prices of bonds went up because of the strong increase in demand from central banks for bonds. They're buying this stuff, the prices go up and the yields go down. That's how it works. If the prices go up, then yields go down. They're buying this stuff, and because all returns converge, people are going to say, listen, but the bonds, the returns are getting so low now, I'm going to start buying something else. I want to buy equities. And now I start buying equities on the Standard & Poor's, on a JSE, wherever the case might be. Because all returns always converge. That's the reason why we have financial markets reaching record highs, yet the real economies are really suffering. Until a month ago, the JSE was on a record high, for instance. This is the reason. There's one problem, however. So, what do? We use bond returns, one of that very liquid assets, and because all returns converge, we force the yields down on a specific asset. The problem is, if you keep on forcing the yields down, then eventually you're going to get to a level that's at 0. And if you get to a level that is at 0, you cannot force yields down anymore, and you use the power of this instrument to push up the prices of equities. And you run out of energy, so to speak. And that's where we are. Now the bond yields on the Japanese, for instance, is at 0.5%. The bond yields on the Americans as at 2%, 2.2%. The bond yields in South Africa is currently at 8%, but that's a bit of a different story I'll get there. So what I'm telling you is this massive increase in equity prices that we've experienced recently has very much to do, not everything, very much to do with bond yields being forced down by central banks. And if central banks force it down to zero, they can't force it below zero, and the energy that's in pushing up equity prices will also disappear. Which is a bit of a red light telling you you must be careful of equity markets. Last week we saw global equity markets taking a bit of a smack. That's one story. Maybe I can just explain it in another way. There's a clever economist, I've forgotten his name. He said that if you walk in the Wild West and you pick up a nugget of gold, then you get all sort of benefits out of this nugget of gold. You can buy a new pair of shoes with that, boots, and a bottle of whiskey and your horse. You can make use of services and all. So a nugget of gold for the guy that picks it up is worth quite a lot. The person that sells the whiskey or a pair of boots and the like, they also get benefit out of this nugget of gold, but it's slightly less. And they're going to buy something else. So as you move away from this nugget of gold, the wonderful power and the positive influence of this nugget of gold gradually diminishes as you move away. That's what we're doing. We're creating nuggets of gold, central banks, but they're creating nuggets of gold out of nothing. And this nugget of gold is called money. And they do that in the bond market, pushing the bond yields down to very low levels. So who are the beneficiaries? Who benefit from central banks' intervention in the financial markets? The people that are closest to the central banks. And who are they? They are the bond markets, they are the money markets, they are the equity markets, they are the big institutional investors, they are the banks, they are the wealthy people with investments on the financial markets. This is what's happening. So equity prices and financial assets keep on rising in value, and the people that do not get the benefit from this are the people far away from the central banks, and they are the poor. They are the people, the rural people. They are the people that are unemployed. And what do you get? A gap between the haves and the have-nots keep on widening. Now here is a scenario. Here is a scenario. And please don't run out, but this is not a good news story. And start selling, but this is a scenario. I couldn't figure it out, it didn't make sense to me, but I think this is a possible scenario. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but here is a possible scenario. Say, for example, we reduce yields as low as we possibly can. And there's still a long way to go for the Americans. The Japanese are standing at 0.5%, the Americans are standing at 2%. So the Americans can still push the yields down to quite, I mean, in the case of the Germans, they're standing 0.8%, and even the French are standing at 1% or so. So there's still some movement. We can still push the yields down in some further. But there is a limit on how far we can push yields down. The moment you can't push yields down any further, you lose the energy that you can get out of the bond market to support your equity markets. That's something that is very important. Remember, equity market prices went up because all yields, all returns converge, and the bond market's been doing well, and now the bond market just stops. It can't do better because we've reached the lower end. We've reached zero, close to zero, and equity prices stop going up as much as that. Remember, short-term interest rates are very low. Short-term interest rates is one of those interest rates that support demand in the economy. That is also at zero globally. In the meantime, bond markets stop going up. The wealth effect of bond markets stops happening. People stop buying, they stop borrowing money. So the velocity of money comes down. The moment the velocity of money comes down, people stop buying. So demand in the economy stops going up artificially. When demand goes down, economic growth goes down. When economic growth goes down, earnings or shares goes down. And since we don't have the energy to keep equity markets up again, equity prices collapse. And where are we then? We are in 1929, the Great Depression. And the reason for the Great Depression is because of excessive debt. You will pay back your debt. You can pay back your debt by inflation, or you can pay back debt by consuming less. Debt is nothing but future consumption, that you've accumulated over time. If I consume more than what I produce, I build up debt. And the day will come that you will consume less than what you produce until you've paid off your debt. And the result of that could potentially lead to a dramatic collapse in equity prices. Most pension funds globally will be underwater. They will cut back on the benefits to their members. The members will spend even less. It will lead to the total dry up of liquidity globally. Banks will stop lending money to each other. Liquidity will dry up. Financial markets will come to a standstill. And this will be the Great Depression. Okay, that's the good news. Something that I think perhaps is not that bad is that there's another fancy economist with the name of Minsky. He said the typical credit bubble is created by private sector credit, or a typical bubble. People borrow money, pushing up property prices, borrow more money against that, and equity banks feel safe to lend you more money because prices just keep on going up. And the day will come when somebody's going to start selling his assets, and the prices start falling. Banks will stop lending you money because the collateral comes under pressure, and everybody's going to run for the door, and that's how a bubble collapses. So a typical bubble is driven by private sector demand for private sector credit. That's not what we have at the moment. What we have today is a property bubble. We've got bubbles. We've got bubbles on a bond market, we've got bubble in an equity market as well, but it's mostly driven by central banks, which is different from the past. It really makes it completely different from what we see in the past. So they're not going to run for the door, or unlikely that they're going to run for the door. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of things in the South African economy. Let me just go back to that and just tell you what will potentially happen to South Africa if this should happen. This sort of scenario could happen. So what's going to happen in this sort of scenario? Remember, asset prices fall, collapse. Equity prices are gone. They collapse with X% or whatever the case might be. Debt is still there. Debt is still around. We have to work this debt away. What will typically happen to a country like South Africa? Because the US dollar is appreciating, everybody's going to run to the best returns and where they feel safe, which is the US dollar. And that's exactly what's been happening the last 2 months or so. The rand will weaken, lead to inflationary pressures in South Africa. Fortunately for us, we do not have that much foreign debt. So we're probably not going to default. But what is going to happen is long-term interest rates are going to go up, and we will have an inflation problem in South Africa. And of course our equity market will collapse as well. An inflation problem is also a bad problem. It will can potentially take you years to work yourself out of that. Other countries like, for example, Greece, they do not have their own currency. Greece doesn't have its own currency, so 3 options for Greece. 3 options. Either you leave the euro area, you reintroduce the drachma, and you simply do a South African sort of approach on that, and you deflate yourself through inflation out of debt. Or you simply default on your debt. You just don't pay off your debt. Or you get the ECB, the European Central Bank, to buy your debt for you. So that's the sort of scenario that the countries like Greece will be faced with. Okay. Let's have a look at the South African economy. Inflation in South Africa, 5.9%, not too bad. Inflation is likely to remain relatively high for some time. Fortunately for us, we've got an economy that's not performing well, because if we had more demand in the economy, inflation would have been higher. But inflation is likely to remain, especially with the very weak currency that we have. So the weak currency is not helping that much on economic growth. Inflation on the high side. Interest rates have been coming down. The repo rate in South Africa, we saw a gradual increase now recently. It's not going to go up much. They're probably going to give us another 25 basis points or so, or maybe another 25, but we're not talking about a very high levels of interest rates in South Africa. Monetary policy has been exhausted. We cannot use monetary policy anymore. The Reserve Bank has reduced interest rates to low levels, trying to stimulate demand in the economy, trying to boost the economy. We've done it now. Inflation is too high. We can't cut interest rates anymore. Monetary policy is now puhai. All right, I'm going to get to fiscal policy just now. Unemployment, and I can go through unemployment. There's a lot to be said about unemployment. It will remain high in South Africa for various reasons. One is because we do not produce the kind of skills that the modern economy needs. Secondly is because of a terrible educational system. And thirdly, and the most important reason, is simply because the economy is not growing. Job creation is a silly idea. Don't create jobs. Easy to create jobs. Get 1,000 people to dig 1,000 holes, and another 1,000 to fill it up. Okay, now what you need to do is grow the economy, and jobs will be one of the results of that. Economic growth, I expect 1.3% for this year, maybe 1.8 next year, I don't know. Weak economic growth. This is what the yield curve in any event is telling us. Weak economic growth for South Africa. Now the Minister of Finance delivered his fiscal budget speech this afternoon. I can go through some of these numbers if you want to. It's not very interesting to go through the numbers. Let me just summarize the whole thing. Essentially what is happening with the Minister of Finance, this is the other big policy instrument tool available to the authorities. They can use monetary policy, we've done that now, it's not available anymore, or we can use fiscal policy. So what is happening at the moment? The economy is growing slower. As the economy slows down, two very important things happen. First of all, the minister's tax revenue comes under pressure. He's not collecting so much taxes anymore. Now you can go through the different taxes. In the case of personal income tax, we still get, in fact, probably going to get a little bit more than the budget in personal income taxes, because personal income taxes is a very special kind of tax. Personal income taxes is paid mostly by very rich people. And very rich people's got very good skills, and they do not get fired. It's not by the poor. Poor but don't pay. And the people that lose their job don't pay personal income tax anyway. And for that reason also, by the way, even if we increase personal income taxes, we're not going to get much more taxes for the Minister of Finance, because we don't have enough rich people. You can do the calculations. So personal income tax is actually doing well despite of a weak economy. Corporate income taxes, and that's the big thing. Corporate income tax is much more. This is the minister's numbers. I don't agree with all these numbers, but the direction more or less. Corporate tax is much more volatile. The economy slows down, corporate income tax collections collapse. You can't increase corporate income taxes because you're going to lose South Africa's, well, the little attractiveness we still have as an investment destination, you're going to lose that. Value-added tax, the first time in many years, this is too low, it's going to be much less than this. The first time in many years, that value-added tax is actually coming in below the budgeted estimates. We are very good at spending in South Africa. We spend like crazy. You can always reckon on the consumer to pull this economy through. The current consumer is tired. The consumers have to pay for increase in petrol prices, for electricity prices, for food prices, for toll roads, for extra taxes here and there. And there's simply not money left to spend. You can see it in value-added tax. This is the minister's number. This number is going to be closer to 10 billion below the budgeted estimates. You can, by the way, if you want more money, you can increase VAT. And you can potentially create quite a lot of money if you increase VAT. The problem with VAT is, the moment you do that, you have to get past Kusatu, and those guys are not very friendly when you increase a consumption tax, a regressive tax, or value-added tax. Nevertheless, the point is, the Ministers of Finance's revenue is under pressure because the economy is weak, and all sort of variables are expressed as a percentage of the economy. So the numerator is smaller now, and your deficit is bigger, and the ratios, fiscal deficit and fiscal debt levels, are getting bigger and bigger. All right. The Minister of Finance this afternoon, at the penny drop, he knows this. He's going to implement a fiscal plan for the next budget. The fiscal plan will include all sort of things, and I think I've got a few highlights here. They're going to stop employing more civil servants. 70% of all people that are employed in South Africa the past 2-3 years, 70% of new people employed are employed in the civil service. They're going to stop doing that now. That's what they say, by the way. State-owned enterprises like that parasitic, or I call them parastatals or parasitals, the state-owned parasitals, what's going to happen is, remember when they painted themselves into a corner with monetary policy, you can't use monetary policy now anymore. You've painted yourself in a corner with fiscal policy as well. You can't use fiscal policy, it's just not available anymore. So what do you do now? You break through the left wall. That's what you do. You can't break through the left wall because our institutions are still very strong. You can't get the Reserve Bank to print money. Lesotho Konyako is not going to do Reserve-style printing of money. So you can't break through the left wall. The public protector is still there. The independence of the judiciary is still there. The independence of the press is still there. So the left wall is difficult to break through, although they're trying to break through. That leaves them with one alternative only, and that's to break through the right wall. And that's what they said today. They're starting to privatize. They're going to sell that state-owned enterprise and use that money to fill the gap at the other state-owned enterprise. They call it something else. You will never ever hear the word privatization. But that's essentially what is going to happen. Not because they want to, but because they are forced to do this Our government is ideologically confused. And they do things because they're forced to do things. He didn't say anything about nuclear, and apparently our good president signed the deal. Maybe they should just let them put it over as well. Tax is going to go up. Tax is going to go up. We know this. I think there's going to be an increase in personal income taxes, 1 or 2% or so. That's symbolic because they're not going to get more money. And I've got a suspicion that's going to go up because they haven't got a choice. That's not going to be very easy. The deficit and the debt is going up. I'm going to show you now. Growth is going to be weaker. Tax is going up. And all right, they're going to keep it. Now, this is a picture of what I've just said. This is state expenditure. Now, it's okay. If I lose my job, how it works in our household, I bring in the money, my wife spends it. That's it. So if I lose my job, then it's okay if my wife keeps on spending to keep our living standard going, because then we're going to go into the overdraft for 2 or 3 months until I find a new job. Then when I get a new job, we take this money, we pay off the overdraft. That's how it's supposed to be working theoretically. The Minister of Finance has been doing exactly the same. We lost the job, that's the financial crisis, so we increased state expenditure. Because revenue collapsed because of the weak economy. The problem is that the moment when the economy started growing, we forgot to start paying back the debt. So we still have this massive gap now, and we still have that in South Africa. Let me show you. This is the state debt as a percentage of GDP. We started off when Trevor Manuel was here, 50%. He brought it down to close to 25%. It took him 10 years. 4 years he doubled that. 4. It's got to be 50% now. There are all sort of technical stuff and so on. Within a year, it's going to exceed 50%. Look what happened. The rating agencies, we had a bad rating. They improved it, and better, and better, and better. And now, worse and worse. We're probably going to see another downgrade within the next year, I would guess, from the rating agencies. Let me show you how our debt really is. Remember, if you're in Japan, the debt levels of Japan is 250% of GDP. 250%. It's a bug in search of a windscreen in the Japanese economy. So they owe so much, things going to go bad in Japan. So they owe a lot of money. If they want to borrow money, they can borrow money at 0.5%. So although the debt levels are very high, the cost of capital is very low. So what I've done, I calculated the one with the other one to actually find out what the real debt burden is, and I just put it on an index. This is America. So America is 100. Just to give you a picture where we are. The red one is in America. There they are. This is Spain. This is Japan. This is South Africa. And one is even worse, the Indians. They're even worse than South Africa. And I've excluded countries like, for example, Greece. I've excluded it from it. Our debt is of the highest in the world. Don't look at the 50%. It's not only this that matters, it's what you pay for debt as well. And that's what I've calculated. This is not sustainable. Okay, we've got another issue, a bit of a problem here, and that's our current account deficit. Our current account deficit in South Africa at the moment is between 5 or 6% of the economy. What is a current account? A current account is the difference between our imports and our exports. So if you have a current account deficit, it tells you import more than what you export. Consume more than what you produce. If you have a current account deficit, it also tells you invest more than what you save. And we don't save enough, or we invest enough. So the current account deficit sort of tells you, in the case of South Africa, that we are a capital scarce country. What we've been doing is like a farmer producing 100 bags of mealies, and we've been consuming 106 bags of mealies for many years now. And now the neighbor's asking his many mealies back. And that's what's happening. So the rand is coming under pressure. Okay, let's be seeing who should be blamed for this. Who are the savers? We're a capital scarce country. Who are the savers? Here they are. This is our corporates, our companies in South Africa. This is how much they save. Those that do part of it. So they do just about all the savings in South Africa. You guys, the households, this is how much you save. Not nearly enough. Very few people can retire financially independent because we don't save enough. And our dear Minister of Finance, how much does he save? This is the Reserve Bank data. This is his. The problem is, there is a zero line. So he's below the zero line here. So he's doing the opposite of savings. Savings means you postpone consumption. The opposite of saving means you consume into the future today. In other words, you destroy capital. The amount of money that the minister, that's bigger than what households save. The amount of money that the Minister of Finance is destroying every year is 100 billion rand. That's the state's saving. If you want to improve saving in South Africa, don't save more. Just stop digging. Just stop saving. The Minister of Finance borrows long-term money and spends on short-term current expenditure, destroying capital in the process. Okay. Now, I can go through the different asset classes. I think people are getting a little bit quiet now. I'm telling you, I'm very concerned about equities, and I've mentioned why. I'm very concerned about equities. Bonds, it is a bubble without a doubt, but I think central banks are keeping bonds where they are. The money market, this is, we are asset managers, and I put sometimes my clients' money in an asset, in a specific investment that can guarantee them a loss. I guarantee my clients a loss, and that's this one, the money market. Because your interest return is actually less than the inflation. It's a guaranteed loss. Can you imagine? And property, I actually like property a little bit. When I'm with property, I mean listed property. Let me just show you one or two things about what's been happening to our dear rand. This is how much the rand's value of the South African rand was in 1970. 43 years later, that is how much of the rand is left. 1%. This is the Reserve Bank's fault, by the way. So, we've lost, if you put your rand under the bed, you would have lost 99% of the value of the rand in just over 40 years. If you compare the South African rand to the US dollars, this is how many dollars we could buy in 1970. This is how many dollars we can buy today, 3. You could buy 100 there, now you can buy 3. Okay. And our consultant told us recently that we want a weaker currency, because then the economy is going to cook. Well, we have a weaker currency now, and see where the economy is. When your currency loses value, we all get poorer. A weak currency is a sign of a poor country. We want a strong currency, not a weak currency. I'm not going to go through this. I just want to touch on something that I think is really interesting. I'm sure you must have heard of this new thing called Bitcoin, and their virtual currencies, and what's going to happen to the world in the next 10 years if we do get a virtual currency. So what can potentially happen? Now, I'm not going to go through the technical part. I don't understand the technical part, but apparently it's safe, and apparently you can't create more of it. So, and you do not have an authority like a central bank that issue a virtual currency. It's limited to how much you can, so it's apparently safe. Let's just accept that, the argument for argument's sake, and let's look at the consequences of potentially what can happen if there is something like a virtual currency, and we all start using a virtual currency. The most important thing about the virtual currency, it is anonymous. People can't see it. Because I take my phone and I transfer money to you, and nobody can see how much I transferred to you. Therefore, the only way that anybody can see how much the transaction was worth, if they can get my cell phone's PIN number. So the Minister of Finance, theoretically, will not be able to tax financial transactions anymore, because he can't see it. I will go and work at the company, and the company will pay me without telling anybody, and nobody can see it because there's no bank statement anywhere. They simply transfer the money. That means, in the case of fiscal policy, a few things need to change. That means, in the future, potentially, we could have Minister of Finance forced into 2 revenue sources only. And those 2 revenue sources are to tax property, because he can get it, and to tax heads, a poll tax. He cannot tax financial transactions because he can't see it. That's the potential consequence of a virtual currency. A monetary policy, what's going to happen to central banks? I will transfer money from you to from myself and to yours, and we don't need central banks. In a new world with virtual currency, we won't have banks anymore. So interest rates, central banks cannot do what they are currently doing, because they will not exist anymore. Trade will be so much easier. I can email money to somebody. I can SMS money to somebody. I can buy what I want, where I want, whenever I want, and it will be a transaction between me and somebody else, and nobody will be able to see that. In a virtual currency world, you will have a limitation how much virtual currency is available. You will use it more and more, and inevitably what it means is that the value of this virtual currency will go up, and the prices of things will come down, and we will live in a deflationary world. During the late 1800s, the US economy went through a deflationary spiral, which was the time of the strongest economic growth in the US economy for a long time. So deflation is not necessarily bad for growth. It also means I can buy child pornography, I can send the money to Osama bin Laden, and nobody will be able to know about this. So the responsibility is with me. But the pen will be where it should be, and that is in my hands. Because I am the most important person there is. Okay, that's just a couple of comments about the virtual currencies. Maybe just a quick summary on what can be expected the next couple of years. I'm very concerned about what central banks are doing. It can potentially lead to a spectacular collapse in an asset class. The asset class that I think is most likely to collapse in a spectacular fashion must be the equity markets. Interest rates are likely to remain very low for a very long period of time. I'm not so sure we're going to see strong economic growth, what everybody is hoping for. The US economy is growing at the moment in the short term. I don't believe it's sustainable for a number of reasons. The European economies are close to or in a recession. We're probably going to see a quantitative easing in Europe as well. The Japanese economy is not going anywhere. What we're probably going to see, we're going to see a real fight between big countries where they all try to devalue their currencies in order to, through a weaker currency, try to grow their economies. The good news for South Africa is that we're part of Africa, the strongest growth region in the world the past 10 years. Sub-Saharan Africa has been doing very well. We've got an exceptionally well-regulated financial system, and very liquid financial system, a very integrated financial system. We can use that modern part of the South African economy to benefit from this strong demand in Africa, but also the strong demand coming from the Chinese and the Indians and the like. So South Africa is actually ideally positioned. Unfortunately, what we have in South Africa, we've got a political class that are ideologically confused. They call themselves all sort of things. We've got a new economic paradigm, we've got a national development plan, or we've got radical economic changes. In one day, you get one minister saying all sort of things. We don't know what we are. Today, the Minister of Finance, if you listen to some of economic ministers, they talk about new liberalism and how bad new liberalism is. And today, the Minister of Finance announced that we're going to privatize. I mean, that's the sort of contradictions that we get from government. There are more than 500 billion rand lying in cash on the balance sheets of corporates in South Africa. They're waiting for a friendly environment where they can put the money into to grow this economy. The biggest investors in South Africa are not the state. There is no investment state by a private sector in South Africa. That's untrue. The biggest investors are still, despite this hostile environment, it still is the private sector. Yet, just imagine if we're going to invest an additional 500 billion in South Africa. So I'm very concerned about the global economy for the reasons that I've mentioned, but the real opportunities for South Africa is that we are part of the emerging economies, and if we can just capitalize on this, and if we can only get the politician to trust us, and most importantly to realize that I am actually the most important person in South Africa, and if I feel happy and safe, I will make more money. Thank you very much.